the Tithe Applotment books. I suppose one of the reasons, in some ways this is work in progress. One of the reasons we're doing it is because over the last year and a half, we've digitized all the Northern Ireland Tithe Applotment books, or nearly all of them. And they're up online, so you can see them. You probably all know that. And we're still doing further work on it. So we're finding out an awful lot about the Tithe Applotment books as we are doing this work. The Tithe Applotment books are one of the big Irish genealogical sources for the early 19th century. As you know, there's the census 1900, 1901, you're going to get the Griffith valuation 1864, and then you get the Tithe Applotment books as a sort of census substitute they vary between about 1824 to 1836, 37. Those books relating to the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, as I said, have been recently digitized, are now available on the PRONI website, and I'll talk about that later. And the books drawn up for the 26 counties of the Republic have been digitized by the National Archives and are presented on the National Archives website. It's a great source. This talk aims to tease out the meaning of these books. Now, sometimes people doing family history, they can tend to look very narrowly, almost myopically, at sources like the Tithe Applotment books or the census, just picking out the surnames that are relevant to them without considering the meaning and the context of, in this case, the tithe system or the tithe books and how they were compiled. As an historian, I tend to make very little distinction between family history and history per se, history in itself. In my opinion, the family historian is simply an historian who's responsible to a particular defined subject. So everybody doing family history is an historian. And the names and the dates of births, deaths, and marriages, they mean much less without understanding of the lives people led. So I think it's very profitable to look at sources like this in historical context. If you find a likely ancestor in one of the tithe books, it'll greatly enlarge your understanding of the life of that person, that family, and their forebears, which are your forebears further back. If you've got an adequate grasp of the system they were tangled up in, why are they in these books? What was involved in being in these books? What did it mean that your people paid tithe? And what kind of tensions were members of the family acquainted with in the 1830s and earlier? Just as knowing what kind of a landlord your family dealt with will powerfully assist you in recreating the life of your ancestors, because that's why you're doing this, so will knowing how tithes operated tell you a great deal about the pressures that your farming ancestors were under during the decades of the 1820s and 1830s, but also much further back to the 1730s, the 1630s, the 1530s. The innocuous-looking lists of names in the tithe books reflected social disturbance and turmoil over decades and even centuries. And the Tithe Act, under which these books were made, probably brought about more turmoil. It didn't bring peace, and that's an interesting development. Now, in the broadest sense, the Irish tithe system was confusing and unjust. And these were the key reasons why it collapsed in the 1820s and 1830s. I've got a little pig and her bonnets there holding the pitchfork and keeping the parson away. The parson is caricatured, of course. It might be a little bit unfair, but they were looking for tithe. That parson was looking for one of her piglets, and that pig wasn't going to let him get it. The statutory tithe books created in these decades were the product of last-ditch efforts to keep the system going. And ironically, they remained in use for very few years before they became defunct. They put these tithe books together, thinking that that would solve all the problems, but within about 10 years, they were abandoned and they were never used again. So it's quite interesting. Now, before I go into the ins and outs of the developments that led to the withdrawal of tithe, I want to try and explain how the system worked and how it lurched and wobbled through to the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century. One of the things about tithes, and here's a very early book, it's a book by the jurist Selden, dating from 1608, and it purports to explain the practice of the payment of tithes, the positive laws made for them, and the opinions touching the rights of them. That's case law and precedent. One of the interesting things about tithes is that there were very few laws explaining how the system should work. The only laws that really had any kind of breadth of, touching different issues go back to the 1200s and 1300s. After about the 1400s, there are no statutes, only the most basic statutes transferring the powers of the early medieval laws. After that, it's just case law and custom. So the only way to understand it is to look and see how it worked. And it worked in a different way all over Ireland and England and Scotland and Wales. It was really very different. There was some basic similarities, but locally there were big differences. And it's difficult so this is an attempt to clarify things. So it's clarifying the system that your ancestors lived with. Now here's all right, I'm going to get rid of, okay, that's gone. Excellent. Here's a couple of broad things to explain tithes. One, tithes are dues paid by congregations for the support of clergymen and the upkeep of parish churches and grounds. Well, actually, that's slightly untrue. Tithes paid for the support of clergymen, but by the 19th century, it was vestry cess that paid for the upkeep of parish churches and grounds. So they had divided it in two. Everything started off simply, and then they kept subdividing it and subdividing it. That was one of the problems. Blackstone, the great jurist of the 18th century, he defines tithes as the 10th part of the increase yearly arising and renewing from the profits of lands, the stock upon lands, and the yearly industry of the inhabitants. That's a kind of a general statement of what tithes are. And it's half true. We'll see. The third thing there is, in the late 18th century, when white boys in Munster were fighting tithes, somebody said that the tithe system was one that no one was clear in, but which everyone understood. That's a kind of a good example. And that was one of the problems, perhaps, but it wasn't the fundamental problem. Now, obviously, I'll go back a little bit. Obviously, tithe of some kind was part and parcel of society from the 500s in Ireland, or from the period that Ireland was evangelized. Patrick arrived in 430s and Palladius. Ireland started to become Christian. The first Christian high king in Ireland was the 560s, Diarmid O'Carroll, and he probably began to put his weight, and the local kings and chieftains began to put their weight behind the collection of tithes from about the 600s, 500s, 600s. Priests had to be maintained by their congregations, and usually priests didn't like totally voluntary contributions. Monasteries were powerful centres of worship right into the later Middle Ages in Ireland, and they controlled civil parishes as well as the conduct of their own contemplative orders. Local chieftains or landowners had the right to appoint rectors to be in charge of parishes, but their power was gradually eroded as the power of bishops appointed directly from Rome increased. So those monastic orders were bit by bit squeezed out. Over about 700 or 800 years, there was a struggle between bishops and monasteries, a struggle for power and control. But even as late as 1500 in Ireland, just before the Reformation was imposed, nearly half of parishes in Ireland were under the rule of the local abbot rather than the bishop. In those parishes, usually one of the monks was appointed what you might call rector and gathered the tithes, which tended to be used for the benefit of the monastery. As regards the cure of souls, either the monastery would provide services for the local congregation, the laity, in their own chapel, in the monastic chapel, or the monastic rector would appoint someone to do the work for them in a specially erected parish church. As this appointee was said to work vicariously for the rector, he became known as the vicar. This is not the phraseology for those kind of offices that was used in Gaelic Ireland, but I'm using these terms for convenience sake, as they became the norm under the established church between the 1500s and the 1900s. So essentially, each parish was owned by a rector, but the work was done by a vicar. So the rector had the right to collect the tithes, but the vicar had the right to be provided with at least a living. During these protracted struggles between the bishop and the monastery, and the bishop was always going to win in the end because the Pope was behind him, it was decided by 1500 that the tithes were divided into what they called greater tithes for the use of the rector, and lesser or small tithes to maintain the vicar or the parish priest. In the terminology of canon law, the rector collected the temporalities and the vicar carried out the spiritualities. Now you get this terminology all the way through the tithe system, right up until towards the end of the 19th century. And you'll come across that language. So already before the Reformation, there was a good deal of complexity in a tithe system which was working in a one-denominational community. So it was all Catholic, or Roman Catholic, but admittedly it had strong ethnic divisions which were reflected in the administration of the church. So in Ireland, you in a sense had a Gaelic church and an English church. You had an English Anglo-Norman originally derived church, and you had the Gaelic church. And the Anglo-Norman church would have been very active in Ulster, eastern Ulster, east of the Bann, where Normans had established quite a few manors from the 1200s on. Now, in practice, it was quite common for bishops also to appoint rectors to oversee parishes, but not to do the daily work. So the division of labour and the division of tithes existed over the centuries. It existed way back before the Reformation. The 400 Irish monasteries, which were active about 1500, began to be dissolved under a statute of Henry VIII in 1537. And their land and their rights were ultimately, over the next couple of decades, confiscated by the crown, directly or indirectly. Landowning magnates usually managed to buy these rights up on the cheap, or they were handed them. And they sat in the future in the place of the monastic rector. So people who've read Hilary Mantel and the Shardlake books there's a huge amount of fascinating details about the confiscation of the monastic lands in the 1530s in England. And more or less the same thing happened in Ireland, but at a later stage. Slightly delayed. So now the right to take tithes was shared between religious and non-religious. And so the tithes were collected, and not only did you have a rector who was religious and a vicar who was religious, but now you had a rector who was often a lay impropriator, as they called them, lay impropriators, and you had a vicar who was a nominee of the lay impropriator. So you had extraordinary complexity, and you had essentially competition for the same amount of money. The landowning magnate sat in the future in the place of the monastic rector. He was often the lay impropriator. Tensions increased. Sometimes the rector collected his own tithe and the vicar collected his tithe separately. Or sometimes the rector did all the collection, and he awarded a slice of the overall tithes to the vicar, which he was obliged to do. If there was no vicar, no tithes could be collected. The proportion of parishes under the control of lay impropriators was as high as 30% in some northern dioceses. Although theoretically the basis of the tithe system, funding the spiritualities of the Church of Ireland, was now rooted in the Crown of Ireland Act 1541, in reality, as I've kind of mentioned, the management of tithe was not defined in statute, and the practice varied from diocese to diocese over time. By 1700, the model had taken more or less the shape it remained in until the 1830s. By and large, the so-called small tithes, the vicarial tithes, were not often collected in Ireland, but exaction of the greater tithes could be severe, and what was worse, deeply inconsistent, so that neighbouring parishes could suffer very different tithe regimes. So your neighbour, who might be just across the townland, might be just over the hedge in a different field, in a different parish, could get much worse tithes or much better tithes. The main crops targeted were oats, barley, wheat and hay. Sheep and lambs were taxed on small holdings. In Munster and in Leinster and in parts of Connacht, tithe was demanded on potatoes, which was the main food crop, of course. Potatoes were exempt in Ulster. Now, back in the 1600s, most tithe was taken in kind. The incumbent of the parish toured the farms every year to collect the 10th sheaf of corn, the 10th pig, and you saw the picture early on of the mammy pig protecting her bonnets from the minister. The sheep or cow, the 10th sheep or cow, or even the 10th pail of milk. By custom in many places, farmers could not remove their hay or crop from a field until the tithe owner or agent had taken the tithe. This could prove disastrous in bad weather because the crop would be just standing in bad weather and they would be prosecuted if they removed it. Very often, Irish clergymen appointed agents called Tithe Proctors to do this grueling work. So the Tithe Proctor was the man who called to farms every year and measured the quantity of harvested crop required, taking it away eventually for sale or use. Now, in Ulster, by the 1690s, the secular population had negotiated a better deal with their Anglican ministers. I've jumped. I don't know what I did there. I jumped way ahead. I'm going to go back. You're going to get a glimpse of some of these things. I jumped to the end. Okay. All right, you got a cartoon there. The secular population negotiated a better deal with their ministers than landholders in the rest of Ireland. Essentially, they were in a privileged position. I mean, they were treated with more respect and they had more power. One of the new arrangements entered into in Ulster by 1695 was the conversion of tithes in kind to tithe payments in small amounts of money. A standard table of tithe payments was established for each crop and item, known as the modus decimandi. In practice, this stabilized payments in Ulster and meant that progressively the value of tithes declined. It was estimated that clergy in Ulster got closer to 5% rather than 10% or a tenth of the agricultural capital of the tenantry. This also meant that tithe problems arose primarily during periods of distress in Ulster, and they weren't a chronic feature of the social landscape. Now, the tithe, that little cartoon shows the wife presenting a tenth of a man to the clergyman, but the clergyman is rejecting the tenth of the man thing and saying that he's a good clergyman, he doesn't actually take tithes, human tithes. Payment in small money payments became more common in the rest of Ireland by the 1780s, although clergy and proctors retained the right to exact tithe when it suited them. And often it suited proctors, and you can imagine that collecting tithe in kind, going onto the fields and actually taking piglets, taking calves, taking milk, taking corn was pretty antagonizing. So it was something that your ancestors went through every year. Now, pasture and stock farming, there was another way in which this was unjust. And it's that in the early 1700s, pasture, grazing cattle as stock and just on pasture became economically more important than tillage in the early 1700s. And they began to build up very large graziers who owned large amounts of land with flocks of sheep and herds of cattle. And they opposed, in theory, the clergy had the right to come on and take a tenth of the sheep and the cattle. But of course, these powerful graziers resisted this and they appealed it. This kind of tithe was called adjustment. And they petitioned against it. And the Irish Commons in 1735, and here's one of the petitions, adjustment was effectively disallowed. Now, the law didn't change, but effectively the clergy just backed down and they didn't collect it. So they didn't collect tithes from the big graziers, but they still needed the same amount of money. And in practice, this meant that the overall burden of tithes fell on insecure smallholders on tillage land rather than on wealthy graziers. And ironically, smallholders continued to pay for the products of animal husbandry on their own limited holdings, while grazing farms were exempt. So essentially, the rich managed to find a way to avoid the tax, and the poor paid more tax. I wonder, does that sound familiar? Now, the Irish system was managed by Tithe Proctors rather than the clergymen themselves. And one of the reasons was the clergymen often didn't live in their parishes, given that the Anglican population was quite small in most of the south and the west of Ireland. These clergy hired curates cheaply to carry out token services in order to retain their rights to tithe. So if you didn't have anybody doing any services in a parish, then they wouldn't be allowed to collect tithes. So you'd have a church in a parish, and then a curate, even if there was no Protestant population or only one or two people, the curate would have to do one or two services a year, and that would more or less legalize the collection of tithes. And then the clergymen also hired proctors to do the dirty work of collecting the tithe. The proctor made an agreement with the clergyman, agreed to pay the clergyman a set amount from the takings, and pocketed the excess. So he had an interest in maximizing the sale of the collection. Tenants paid, but not landlords. The usual procedure was for the tithe proctor and his assistants to view the crops in July, noting the yield and the potential value of the crop. Then they'd visit again before harvest and make a bargain with the occupier as to how much tithe should be paid, either in kind or in money. The one advantage that tenants had was that, unlike in the case of rent, the proctor did not have the right to seize animals or crops if the tithe wasn't paid. Instead, he had to prosecute to petty sessions or to the consistorial courts. So if you didn't pay rent, then the landlord had the right to basically go in and take your cows and sell them, auction them off, or take your crops and auction them off and use the money to pay your rent. The clergyman didn't have that right. He could only prosecute to court. But that was a very, very vexatious thing, and it caused a lot of problems. In any case, most of the clergymen found ways around these legalities. Now, the tithe books that we're looking at were all created in the 1820s and 1830s, but people were collecting tithes, well, under the established church from the 1550s. So a natural question that might come to mind is, surely there was tithe proctors, there were clergymen collecting tithes, surely there was tithe books before the Tithe Applotment books of the 1820s and 1830s. And there were tithe books. And most of them, nobody has done a full collection of them. But while I was preparing for the talk, I went through our own collection and I picked out a bunch of tithe books that we've got going back to the 1700s. There's a nice one from Enniskillen and Derrybrusque in a Fermanagh, 1710, and a couple from Finglas Parish in 1717, 1719, and 1720. Another one from 1773, 1785, and I'd have to order that out to see what parish it relates to, but it's from Derry. And then also St. Colum's Cathedral, Vestry Book and Tithe Lists, and then Killinchy Parish, 1794, and also 1893. So there were tithe books, and some of them have survived. And over time, I think it would be wonderful to add these tithe books to the Tithe Applotment books, because in a sense, they are the precursors to the Tithe Applotment books. And some of them have quite a lot of names in them. I've got the list of names there, 80, quite a lot of names. So it's quite interesting. And you can see how they'd be like having rent books going way back. Now, it's obvious from the number of officials involved. You've got the clergyman, you've got the rector, the vicar, you've got the tithe proctor. The tithe proctor would have assistants, all these different people. Everybody had to get paid. So you had to basically maximize the amount of money you're getting from the tenant in order to pay everybody the kind of money they wanted. So a lot of the tithe payments went to intermediaries as much as to clergymen. And one of the things that, as I said, the person who owned the parish was often the rector, was often a lay impropriator. The lay impropriator basically held it like he'd hold a house or land, and he might let it out or sell it. And here's an example, the Dublin Evening Post 1820, of tithe farming, that was called, where you would basically sell your right to the tithes on a particular parish, and people would buy it just to make a profit. So you can imagine the number of pressures that were on people at the time. And the overarching injustice was glaringly obvious to all. You had a Catholic and a dissenting Presbyterian and other population obliged to pay tithe to office holders in the established church, although, of course, they took no conceivable benefit from the spiritual or other activities of the ministers. And they had to pay their own clergymen, of course, as well. So they were paying for the upkeep of the Church of Ireland, and they were also paying for the Catholic and Presbyterian and Methodist clergymen. Now, it's interesting when you look at the Church of Ireland, in most of the denominations, the clergymen raise money by what they call small dues. So they get money from people at baptisms, at funerals, at all kinds of, in the Catholic Church, when sacraments are delivered, are ministered to people, and people pay money. And also Easter dues, and money's given then. Now, in the Church of Ireland, the money was raised through tithes. So the ordinary members of the Church of Ireland didn't pay small dues. So in practice, their small dues were subsidized by tithes. So obviously people resented this. And I'm going to just mention the sort of conflict that occurred. Now, here's a couple of conflicts. Here's one, Oma Sizes, Tithes prosecution, March 1793. And it gives you an idea of the temper involved. It's a letter from James Hamilton, the agent, to the Marquis of Abercorn in March 1793. One Owen McGranahan, a rioter of Inishowen, who's with 3 others positively charged with having been a party of more than 40, who lately seized the tithe manager of Mr. Goldsbury, the tithe proctor, and having set fire to his house, were proceeding to cut off his tongue, his toes, and his fingers when they were fired on, and 2 of the rioters were killed. On a strong affidavit made by him of wanting a material evidence, the judge permitted his trial to be postponed to the next assizes. If he had been convicted, which there is no doubt of, an application was intended to be made by the gentlemen of the jury for his immediate execution and being hung on chains in the spot. Now you can see the way violence is used. There's official violence and unofficial violence. It was a violent society. Now, here's another kind of thing closer to the Tithe Applotment books. This is just the same year, just the year before they started making the Tithe Applotment books. And it's one of the reasons they finally did this. Yesterday morning, between the hours of 1 and 2 o'clock, a numerous body of white boys, some of them armed, set on fire a haggard and consumed 3 stacks of corn and a quantity of hay, the property of Daniel Sullivan, Tithe Proctor, residing in the parish of Glenville, within 8 miles of the city. The ruffians then repaired to Sullivan's house, dragged him out of bed, and swore him not to proceed with the recovery of tithes at the sessions. While in the house, they leaded 5 muskets. That means they poured lead down the muskets so they couldn't be used. Obliged Sullivan's wife to hold a candle for them all the time. They afterwards went to the house of another farmer called Joyce, where they supposed tithe corn was deposited, and swore him, I forget what they swore him to do. I can't even see it. The man's denial alone saved the haggard from destruction. They took away a horse from another man who had it published at the chapel in the neighbourhood, and it was shortly after returned. So this wasn't as violent as in 1793, but there was plenty of violent acts. These were incredibly common all over Ireland. Now, between the 1790s and the 1820s, there was various parliamentary initiatives to commute tithe payment and to rationalise the system. The idea was that they didn't want to stop tithes, but they wanted to make it more rational, assuming that if it was all rational, people would be happy enough. Now, there's some truth in that, but not enough truth. During episodes of distress and poverty, between 1817 and 1822, tithe was withheld all around Munster and Leinster especially. Eruptions of violence were common, and I've given you a couple of examples. In response, first, the mildly liberal Tory government of Lord Liverpool ended the exemption of ageastment, aiming to compose tithes, or ended the exemption of ageastment, reducing the pressure on tillage. So that thing where graziers didn't have to pay tithes, they ended that. That was a start. By early 1823, government had drawn up legislation aiming to what they call composed tithes. That is to create a fixed payment per parish for the support of clergy. So the idea was, instead of people coming every year and working out how much tithes you had to pay, and it would keep changing every year. So there was constant disputes over how much tithes the clergyman should get. You would have a fixed amount, and the fixed amount would be the same every year. And in theory, that would cause less argument and less resentment. Well, maybe. So under the Tithe Composition Act of July 1823, the minister or the lay appropriator or 5 large landowners in each parish were encouraged to ask the Lord Lieutenant to create a special vestry in each parish. This vestry was to be made up of the 20 persons who paid most tithes in the parish. So it's a committee of all the tithe payers of the parish. And they were enabled to meet and decide whether or not to commute the ordinary multiple payments into one fixed composition, annually payable per parish. So they were told, you can organize this vestry, and you could decide, would it be more convenient to have a fixed payment? And you have a fixed payment for the entire parish, and everybody in the parish who pays tithes would pay a proportion of that payment. And since everybody would know in advance what they had to pay, in theory, they would be less disputatious and less resentful. Now, obviously, not everybody had a choice in this. It was only the 20 top taxpayers. Now, and they had to meet first to make a decision. Now, if they desired a tithe composition, if they decided, okay, we'll go with it, and the image there that you're looking at is a circular explaining the act, which was sent around to all the clergymen and the big tithe payers. If they desired a tithe composition, then they appointed an independent tithe commissioner to determine the amount of the composition. So they said, okay, we'll have a fixed amount. So how do they decide? Who decides the fixed amount? You get an independent tithe commissioner. And the minimum amount was calculated under the Act by the tithe commissioners, and they looked at the amount of tithe charged over the 7 previous years, up to the 1st of November 1821. And they divided it in 7, basically, and said, okay, this is going to be the standard amount. And if it was too high, you could vary it every 3 years. Now, the tithe commissioners they fixed the amount, and then they were required to appoint tithe surveyors by early 1824 in order to plot or measure the area of holdings over 1 acre by parish, excluding on each farm the waste ground, which was exempt from tithes. So the idea was they fixed a payment per parish, say it was £20, and if there was 40 people who paid tithes, you had to see how much land did each person have, so what proportion of the £20 were they liable to. So you had to get this tithe surveyor who came along and surveyed the parish. Proportional liability to parish tithe was then strictly divided up among the different landholders. And the results were tabulated in books open to public inspection, known from the mid-1820s as the Tithe Applotment books. So this is where the Tithe Applotment books came from. The tithe commissioner decided the overall amount, and then the tithe surveyor allotted the land and decided, and then the commissioner looked at it and decided what proportion of the overall amount each person would pay. Now, all right, actually, I wonder. This is the extract from the Tithe Applotment book, from the Act establishing the Tithe Applotment book. Every such assessment and allotment so made shall be entered in a book to be furnished for that purpose, and to be carefully kept in the custody of the resident ecclesiastical incumbent or minister of such parish. And such assessment and allotment shall state the amount of the whole composition to be paid in each parish, the particulars and annual value of the land holden by each occupier, the amount of the composition, the rate at which such amount is calculated, To the several persons entitled to such composition, the book containing the same shall be open for the inspection of every occupier of land in the said parish at all reasonable times without fee or reward. Now, so that's the Act. That is the description of the Tithe Applotment book. I'm going back because I had actually changed something there, but I can see what's happened. Now, there was a lot of uncertainty at first, parish by parish, as to whether to take out the Act. The ordinary parishioners didn't have much influence on proceedings. So if your ancestors were, unless they were fairly wealthy in a parish, they wouldn't have had much say in it. They would have suffered the consequences, but they didn't have much say in it. Out of about 361 functioning parishes in northern dioceses, only 25 of them applied to the Lord Lieutenant by mid-1824. There was 1,002 parishes applying countrywide. And here's an example. It's a Tithe Vestry meeting, Drumbeg Parish. A meeting took place a few days since in this parish for the purpose of carrying out this Act. The parishioners offered the clergyman an annual payment of £260, being £20 a year more than they've been let to for a yearly tenant for some time, and at which he surrendered them as too high. This offer was rejected, and a demand of £350 or £100 more than they had been let for was made, to which the parishioners would not agree. Under these circumstances, and as the tithe books were not produced, the treaty terminated. And this is quite interesting because you can see how everybody had to meet. They decided they did want a tithe composition. They offered the clergyman a certain amount. Up until that point, there was the vicar, who was the clergyman, and there was the rector, who was the guy who owned the parish. The lay impropriator. The rector was farming the tithes for £350 a year. So the parishioners were paying £350 a year. But the rector was only getting £260 a year. So the impropriator was making a profit of £100. So the parishioners just said, well, look, you don't need this profit. We'll keep paying you £260 a year. In fact, £240 a year. The clergyman said, no, I want the £350 a year, which the farmer got. And they couldn't agree. Under these circumstances, and as the tithe books weren't produced, you can see there that they all wanted to see the tithe books which the proctor had. So these are tithe books which existed before the Tithe Applotment books. So there's evidence that all these parishes had tithe books. So a lot of them have been lost, unfortunately. Now, here's an example of vestries which agreed all over Ireland, September 1823. There wasn't very many from the north. Here is, on the Tithe Applotment books, we've got some lovely documents relating to the organisation of tithes. And you'll see all this sort of stuff. And this is telling you what was going on. And they're often signed by other people. And these people are basically the neighbours of your ancestors. Henry Clark was a very important guy in Lade Parish. And everybody in Lade Parish would have known him very well. Here's the tithe composition documents, all the official documents. You can see the lovely seals and that. And these are all on the Tithe Applotment books up online. At the same time, we have the Tithe Applotment books, but we don't have the previous books. The previous books were the property of the clergymen themselves, and there was no act to determine that the clergyman had to take care of them. So around this time, 1823, 1824, and 1826, the state decided to set out in legislation that all of the vestry books, the Tithe Applotment books, and the documents were public documents and had to be kept, and the clergyman was accountable for their safekeeping. So it's very interesting. That's why we still have them, basically. Now, I'm skipping a couple of things here. Here's an example where the parish of Derryahy, the Tithe Applotment book was made, 1828. And it was put in the house of Mr. Joseph Workman, and everybody could look at it, because obviously the allotment was made, but that doesn't mean that people agreed. Somebody might be down for 20 acres when they they believed they only had 16 acres or 18 acres. So they had the right to see the Tithe Applotment book and discuss it before it took final form. Now, tithe compositions. Now, vestry agreement was still hard to reach. Often the incumbent refused to accept the composition offered. For this reason, an amending act in June 1824 provided that the Lord Lieutenant could compel parties in disagreement, once a special vestry had been formed, to appoint tithe commissioners and to proceed with the composition under supervision. So initially it was kind of voluntary, semi-voluntary. Now they made it kind of compulsory. Step by step, the process advanced. But as late as 1832, out of 2,500 Irish parishes, only 1,500 or 63% had undertaken tithe composition. Numbers remained lower in Ulster, where only half of them, 189 out of 360 parishes, had taken up the option. So Ulster was slower to take up this option. Now, one of the things about this act was if you didn't pay your tithes, the clergyman now had the power to seize your crops. So in fact, the funny thing was, although the act was intended to simplify and rationalize the system and to bring peace to a system full of conflict, in practice, it made things worse because two things happened. The composition, the payments, the clergyman would only agree quite high payments, unfairly high payments, in fact, and I won't go into that. So when there was composition, the composition was too high. The second thing was they now had new legal powers to seize crops. So they could send people onto the land and grab the crops. So it immediately increased the number of possibilities for altercation and dispute. Also, since the graziers now paid tithes, they were more powerful, they were more politically educated and literate, and they were able to organize a very serious campaign, political campaign, to end tithes. And that was the Tithe War. So although the Tithe Applotment books came out of an attempt to finish off tithe conflict, the Tithe War developed out of the Tithe Applotment books, you could say, which is quite ironic. And there was sporadic violence breaking out by late 1831. A campaign to refuse tithe payment was developed, and in response, soldiers were used to enforce seizures. So the clergyman had the right to grab the crops. They didn't want to go on the crops, to grab the crops, because huge crowds gathered to resist them. So they got soldiers to accompany the people to grab the crops. Inevitably, the soldiers used their guns, and there were casualties. One of the early affrays was Carrickshock in Kilkenny in December 1831, where perhaps 45 people were killed. One of the last affrays was Gertrow Rathcormac, the farm of the widow Ryan in County Cork in December 1834, where 20 protesters were shot by the military. And you can see there the people shooting the guns. The people were protecting the crops. That's why they were there. That never happened before the 1820s. It only happened after 1823. So it's interesting and ironic. Now, drastic action was taken. The arrears of tithe were cancelled by 1834, and a new tithe rent charge abandoned tithe composition, significantly reduced tithe payments, and combined a reducing scale of tithe payments with rent on every estate. The Tithe Applotment books no longer served the purpose for which they'd been created. The tithe rent charge was no longer paid to the Church of Ireland after the Act of Disestablishment in 1871, but it continued to be paid to the Commissioners of Church Temporalities for some years. So you'll recognize those church temporalities. I was mentioning some of those things. Now, I'm going to approach a few different things quickly and discuss the genealogical side of it. One of the initial things is these, before I look at the Tithe Applotment books, is the Tithe Defaulters' Affidavits. In 1831, when the Tithe War was really letting rip, clergymen couldn't collect their tithes, so they had arrears of tithes. They needed to live. So the government introduced an act. If the clergyman applied to government explaining why they hadn't got their tithes, they would be given an amount as a in lieu of tithe, on the theory that they get the tithes back eventually when the whole thing was settled. So they would send in a form and they would give a big list of all the people who owed them tithes. And these are known as the Tithe Defaulters Affidavits. They're held in the National Archives. They hold, there's about, let's see, I've got the total number of people is 29,000 names from all around Ireland. And they're all digitized now, and they're available on Find My Past. So that's quite a useful way to start off looking, who are these tithe defaulters in 1831? Now, where do the Tithe Applotment books go? The Tithe Applotment books, that's the Tithe Composition Act, known as the Rent Charge Act. The Tithe Applotment books were given to the Church Temporalities Commission. The Church Temporalities Commission sold all the land to tenants in the 1870s after the Disestablishment Act. From 1881, the Irish Land Commission were collecting the annuities from the tenants. And the Land Commission basically they got a hold of the Tithe Applotment books. Eventually in 1922, at partition, a Northern Ireland Land Purchase Commission was set up, and they got nearly all of the Tithe Applotment books relating to the north of Ireland. Some of them were left behind in Dublin, and I'll discuss that in a few moments. So that's how the Tithe Applotment books survived. They eventually were ended up given to PRONI by the Ministry of Finance in the 1930s, and that's how we've got them. So it's a big, long story. That's how they appeared. Now, here's a standard format for the Tithe Applotment books. You can see there was kind of printed versions done in Belfast and in the different major towns. The printers would do up these standard versions. And you can see there's ruled columns, townland, the name of the occupier, the quantity of land held, the acreage and all that, the quality of the land, rough or arable or whatever it was, the total quantity of each quality. So if they had water, it would just give the quality of the water. If that was a river or a lake. And then the total quantity in the townland, and then it would give the amount of tithes, and that's literally the proportionate liability to tithe from the overall payment. So it's a proportion, and then it would give at the other side there on the right hand side. You can see the untithable land. So everybody had a certain amount of untithable land, and this was a kind of a standard amount, a standard way of setting it out. And here's a kind of a closer view of this. So you can see there the townland, the name of the occupier, the quantities in detail, and the quality and the total quantity in the holding. So this will tell you the name in each townland. This is the town parks in Larne, and the quantity of land that they held. And the nature of the land they held. It doesn't tend to give the land ownership, although there are Tithe Applotment books in the west of Ireland that do give land ownership. That's the owner, because these are all tenants. Here's the Tithe Applotment book in Ballignure parish in Antrim, and it gives, these are all from the website, the PRONI website, and I'll explain how you get those in a moment. So you can see the townland, the name of the occupier, quantities in detail. It's all a kind of a standard thing. But it didn't have to be standard. And here's the Armoy book for 1834, and it's much simpler. It's just a handwritten thing with a list of names per townland and the proportionate amount of the tithe. Now, that all had to be calculated. So the Tithe Commissioner did the calculation. And he worked out that if you owned, 1% of the total titheable land in the parish, then you paid 1% of the total amount of tithe composed for the year. So that's how it was arrived at. Now, when you're looking at the tithes, and this is kind of an interesting thing, the standard thing is that you go into the tithe books and you'll get a certain number of people listed. And Generally, it's been assumed that it's everybody over 1 acre, and it's also not people in villages and towns. But in fact, it's in reality, because of the way tithe was governed in a customary fashion, it's very difficult to summarize who exactly is listed by townland. Who are these people? Are they leaseholders? Why are they liable, and why are other people apparently not liable? Because not everybody is usually included. Sometimes most people are included, and that's a little exercise which I'm going to go into in a minute. Now, that's got to do with the nature of tithes themselves. Tithes were defined to be the 10th part, and they were payable by everybody unless there was a special exemption. But the exemption wasn't. The funny thing is that it wasn't as if, you could say, I've got under 1 acre, so I'm exempt. It was really, in reality, when I go through the Tithe Applotment books, and we can see this now because we're doing this massive exercise, I've often found people who own less than 1 acre and they're still paying tithes. In reality, it's only the goods on the land that are tithable. It doesn't matter how much or how little you own. If you have tithable land, then you're theoretically liable to tithe. So it extends to all occupiers of unprivileged land, whether by wrong or right. That's right in terms of by trespassers or by just title. So the owner didn't pay the land, didn't pay the tithe. The person who sowed the crops and cut the crops, or who owned the cow and who pastured the cow, those were the ones who paid the tithes. Now, in practice, all sorts of strange customs grew up. So in practice, a lot of clergymen just said, look, if you own less than 1 acre, I'm not going to bother tithing you. But it was very much a customary thing. And at the end there, it says the king is entitled to the tithes in places extra parochial. And that's a kind of an interesting thing, which I'm going to come to in a minute. Now, you can look at all the Tithe Applotment books for all of Northern Ireland. And most of them are date from the 1832 to 1836 period. You can also look at the census for 1831, and it's very useful to see how many people are in the Tithe Applotment books, what proportion of those people, of the parish householders, are actually included in the Tithe Applotment books. And I did a small exercise, so this is only a sketch exercise. I'm going to do, over the next 6 months or so, we're finishing off a big index to these Tithe Applotment books. And we're going to have a very clear picture of what's going on. And it's quite worthwhile knowing this, because if you find that your household or your ancestor doesn't appear in the Tithe Applotment book, you will get an idea. You might wonder, well, how many people are included, and what likelihood is it that they're living there, but they're just not included. So I took a bunch of parishes, Fermanagh, Antrim, Down, Armagh, and I looked at the number of families. I worked out a proxy estimate for the number of families in 1831 in this parish, and then I looked at the number of holdings, and you get a very interesting thing. You get, in some parishes, 1831 Bow, there's actually 122%, so there are more holdings than there are families, and that's a complex thing. It's not an invalid result, but I won't go into it because it's too detailed. But it gives you an idea that most householders are actually included. In other ones, you'll get a variation from, in the Munchas in Armagh, almost everybody's included on the Tithe Applotment books. So it works out almost has a full list of householders. In other words, in other places, it's a 70% approximation. In other places, it's 60%. In other places, it's down to 37%. We will have a full listing by the time we're finished this exercise. So it'll give you a very clear picture of how much of a census the Tithe Applotment books amount to. And that'll be a very useful piece of information, which you'll get ultimately. Now, when you're looking at every Tithe Applotment book, you'll see that the people will be given, everybody will be given an area, or in a lot of them, they'll be given areas, and but the acreage will either be in statute acre, Cunningham acre, or Irish acre. Here's a brief thing. The statute acre was made the imperial measure from 1824. The Cunningham acre, which was a standard plantation acre, is 1.3 statute acres, and the Irish acre is 1.6 statute acres. So when you want to find out how many acres your ancestor held, just bear this in mind. Every Tithe Applotment book will tell you if it's a statute acre, a Cunningham acre, or an Irish acre. So that'll tell you how much land in modern terms they owned. Now, when you look at tithe maps in England, something similar happened in the 1820s and 1830s, although there was much less conflict. And tithe commissioners went all around England and they did tithe maps as well as tithe Applotment books. So they're very lucky in England because they do wonderful tithe maps. And here's an example of one from Swale Parish in 1836. And every single farm is listed in a Tithe Applotment book, and it's mapped in Tithe Applotment maps. So these are beautiful things. You can see that's just a very nice little thing, very pretty and wonderfully useful. We have Ordnance Survey maps, and these are digitized on the PRONI website, but we have very few Tithe Applotment maps. I'm going to just show you a couple of examples. From Lade Parish, 1828, there's very general ones. I don't fully see the function of these. They don't show individual holdings. They only show townlands. So probably by the end of this exercise, I have a clearer picture of why they did these tithe maps. You'll only find them on some parishes, but they're quite interesting when you do find them. But unfortunately, we don't get tithe maps like you got in England. Here's a nice one, though. This is Monshas Parish, and it's 1833, and it's very pretty. So it's nice to have it. I'm glad I have it, but it doesn't show you the actual holding, like you can see on the valuation maps under the Griffith valuation in the 1860s. So it's a pity, but they're there. Now, I said that in 1922, the Tithe Applotment books were divvied up between the South and the North. As it happened, some of them were accidentally kept in Dublin for different reasons. And here's a list of the ones that were kept in Dublin. Some of them we've got as printouts and on microfilm. Some of them are on the National Archives website. And some of them, Kidawley and Temple Carn in Fermanagh, they exist in the National Archives, but they haven't been digitized, and we don't have them either. We may approach the National Archives to see if we can actually include them on our own digitized body of parishes, but it hasn't been done as yet. So you can see how certain parishes don't exist yet. Now, here's another thing. If you look at all the different Tithe Applotment books that we've got, you'll see that there's certain parishes where there doesn't seem to be any Tithe Applotment books. And here's a list of those parishes. In Antrim and in Derry, there's Glenwherry, the Grange of Ballyscullion, Grange of Doak, Grange of Drumtulla, Grange of Lade, Grange of Nilcheen, and Agivy in Derry. Now, why don't they have Tithe Applotment books of their own? Initially, I thought that people in those places didn't pay tithe. But again, they were known as tithe-exempt districts. They're extra-parochial districts. And you would have noticed way back that the king was entitled to the tithes of extra-parochial districts. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, these were lands that were held by monasteries. The king took over these lands. In practice, the king didn't charge tithes. In practice, what happened was that the people living in these parishes, and you can see the population listed on the table, they, most of them would have been either Church of Ireland or Presbyterian. If they wanted to go to the local Church of Ireland church, they went to the church in a neighbouring parish. And whatever neighbouring parish catered for them effectively collected tithes from them. There was no statutory basis for this. It was customary. And I have discovered while doing these Tithe Applotment books that if you're looking for the people living in these parishes, you have to go to neighbouring tithe, the Tithe Applotment books relating to neighbouring parishes to get them. So I haven't worked out all of these things yet, but you can see for the Grange of Ballyscullion, you go to the Tithe Applotment book for Dunane Parish. For the Grange of Drumtulla, you go to Derrykeehan Parish. For the Grange of Agivy, you go to Agadowey Parish. So all of these things, this is kind of work in progress, and it's taking time going through these things laboriously. We'll have solved all these problems over the next 6 months, but this is just kind of at least a start. Now, there's also land that was tithe free, and this is a bit of a mystery. Here's an example. These may not exist in the parish of Cumber, the actual people living on the island of Ballyalolly. So this is a kind of a peculiarity. I don't know why these lands were tithe free. They didn't pay tithe to anybody, the tenants living in these. So at least in theory, they shouldn't be in the Tithe Applotment books. But I have to check all these. Here's another one, the town of Lisburn in the parish of Killinchie. This isn't the land itself, but now, if you're looking for the Tithe Applotment books in PRONI, you go on to the e-catalogue. Because of the connection problems we had last week, I didn't go, and I can't show you this. I thought it'd be safer not to try. You go into the e-catalogue, you go into under the browse button, and you put in FIN 5A, and you'll call up the Tithe Applotment books. You click, you do a couple of clicks, and you'll get into a point where you can view every single Tithe Applotment book. And that's a wonderful, you'll find the entire PDF for each Tithe Applotment book is there, and it's a wonderful facility, really fantastic. At the moment, we're preparing an index, and this index will also be available. We did have an earlier index, and if you, in the old days, when you could come into the public search room, and hopefully before too long, you could go and look at this index under the microfilm. On microfilm. It was essentially a card index which was prepared in the 1960s by the prisoners in Crumlin Road Jail, as it happens. It was a huge exercise back in the 1960s, and quite a good index, but not anything to the kind of accuracy that we're going to have over the next 6 months' time. When you go into the search room, all these cards happened to have been copied by the Church of Latter-day Saints. The Church of Latter-day Saints made an agreement with Baltimore Genealogical Publishing, and it was all put onto a database. And this database is available as a preliminary index in the search room on one of the monitors. And it's a very simple thing. You can kind of go in, put in a name, you'll get a quick indication as to what parish the different names are. You can locate the different names, and then you can order out the parish and go to that, the digitized version of the parish on our website. You can do that on the website online, or you can do it in the search room. Now, I'm only showing you the index as it exists in the search room. Until you can get back into the search room, you won't be able to use that index. But within a few months, we will have a new online index, which will make things still easier. So it'll be a great improvement. Now, I'm going to stop there. I know I've gone over the hour, and as I always do.